The process involved in voluntary movement of a skeletal muscle starts in the prefrontal cortex and passes via the basal nuclei, thalamus and cerebellum to the brainstem. The signal from the central nervous system then passes via uninterrupted myelinated somatic motor nerves to the end plate of muscle fibers, resulting in depolarization of the muscle fibers and the generation of muscle force. The level of force generated in an active skeletal muscle can be controlled through the careful recruitment of a number of motor neurons, which, in themselves, innervate a defined number of muscle fibers. Thus, the activation of motor neuron 1 in this slide will cause the red fibers to contract and generate force. The activation of motor neuron 2 in this slide will cause the blue fibers to contract and generate force. And the activation of motor neuron 3 in this slide will cause the purple fibers to contract and generate force. So, if we look first of all at the number of active motor neurons, we're addressing the S parameter of the ESTi-score, a physiological phenomenon called spatial summation. Activation of motor neuron 1 causes the red fibers to contract and generate very little force. If the central nervous system simultaneously activates both motor neurons 1 and 2, then both the red and blue fibers contract, and they generate more force than either motor neuron 1 or 2 are capable of alone. Similarly, activation of motor neurons 1, 2 and 3 generate even more force than motor neurons 1 and 2 together. In other words, activation of greater numbers of motor neurons in a muscle has an additive effect on the force produced in that muscle. Next, let us take a look at the rate of activation of motor neurons. Now we are addressing the T parameter of the ESTi-score, a physiological phenomenon called temporal summation. Activation of motor neuron 1 at a rate of 2 stimuli per second, that is at 2 Hz, causes the red fibers to contract and generates very little force, typically a contraction we refer to as a twitch. If the central nervous system activates motor neuron 1 at a faster rate, say 5 stimuli per second, that's 5 Hz, then the red fibers contract in a step-like fashion, such that each new stimulus builds on an existing level of force. This occurs because the next stimulus comes at a point in time when the muscle fibers are already contracted to some extent. This rate of motor neuron activation gives jerky movements, and you can see the individual stimuli in the blue force curve. If the central nervous system now activates motor neuron 1 at a much faster rate, let us say 35 stimuli per second, that's 35 Hz, then the force generated by the red fibers not only becomes additive, in other words more forceful, it also results in a much smoother type of movement. In order to examine the E parameter of the ESTi-score, then we need to return once again to a slide that illustrates a number of motor neurons in a muscle. In this example, we have the red, blue and purple motor neurons, all of which are being activated at a rate of 35 stimuli per second, that's 35 Hz. Here we see that the red motor neuron is activated a little ahead of the blue motor neuron, illustrated by the red vertical arrows, which in turn is active slightly ahead of the purple motor neuron. The result is that the red motor neuron activates the red fibers which contract and produce force more slightly ahead of the blue fibers. Activation by the blue motor neuron, which in turn produces muscle force slightly ahead of the purple fibers activated by the purple motor neuron. The combined muscle force is illustrated by the blue curve to the far right of this slide. Note that it is additive. That is to say that the individual forces produced by the red, the blue and the purple fibers sum to produce a force that is greater than any single motor neuron response. However, note also that the additive blue force curve has a rounded top, due to the fact that the efficiency or the synchronization of the red, blue and purple neurons is not optimal. That is to say that some fibers are starting to relax when others are starting to contract. With repeated training, the central nervous system improves the efficiency or synchronization of active motor neurons in muscles. They begin to fire at the same time, resulting in perfect synchronization of fiber contraction, and as a result, the blue force curve looks typically more like the one illustrated in this slide. No longer round-topped, but instead more pointed. And, due to an improved efficiency of fiber activation, the force generated is also enhanced. This is the typical response that we notice when we start training our muscles. It has nothing to do with the muscle fiber growth, but rather a more efficient and synchronized control of muscle fiber activation by our central nervous system. Thus, the central nervous system has a number of options when it comes to generating force in a muscle. It may choose, as illustrated by the upper panel, to activate a large number of motor neurons and thereby activate many muscle fibers. This will be seen on the CURO system as an ESTi-score with a low S parameter, in this case 3 out of 10, whilst the T parameter may well remain quite high, in this case 8 out of 10, which indicates a low firing rate of active motor neurons. Alternatively, the central nervous system may choose to focus on the T parameter, as illustrated by the middle panel, activating only a few motor neurons, which will be seen on the CURO system as an ESTi-score with a high S parameter, in this case 8 out of 10, whilst the T parameter will be quite low, in this case 3 out of 10, which indicates a high firing rate of the few active motor neurons. The lower panel illustrates what happens typically after a period of training, where the E parameter, which represents the efficiency or synchronization of active fiber contraction, is greatly improved, as illustrated by the lower panel. Thus, activation of only a few motor neurons and at a low firing rate, which will be seen on the CURO system as an ESTi-score with a high S and T parameter, in this case both 7 out of 10, occurs at a high degree of efficiency. The E parameter is quite high, in this case 8 out of 10, which indicates a high degree of synchronized fiber contraction resulting from a trained and synchronized firing rate of the relatively few active motor neurons. In this way, the central nervous system can determine precisely the force generated by a skeletal muscle by determining the number of active muscle fibers, the rate with which they contract, and the efficiency of synchronization, all represented by the ESTi-score as part of the CURO system.